It was a peaceful Wednesday afternoon in the small town of Millbrook when Walter Richardson, a 68-year-old retired school teacher, decided to make his weekly trip to Johnson's grocery store. The autumn breeze gently rustled the golden leaves as he carefully made his way down Cedar Street, his wooden cane providing the support he needed for his arthritic knees. After 35 years of teaching mathematics at Millbrook High School, Walter was a familiar and beloved figure in the community. The grocery store was only 4 blocks from his modest two-story home, a journey he had made hundreds of times before. Today, he carried a small list in his pocket, planning to pick up ingredients for his famous sweet potato pie. His granddaughter Sarah was coming to visit over the weekend, and he wanted to surprise her with her favorite dessert. As Walter walked out of Johnson's grocery store with 2 brown paper bags, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He had just started his journey home when a police cruiser suddenly pulled up beside him, its tires screeching against the asphalt. Officer James Matthews, a man who had been with the Millbrook Police Department for only 8 months, stepped out of the vehicle with his hand already resting on his belt. "Hey, you there! Stop right where you are!" Officer Matthews barked, his voice unnecessarily loud and aggressive. Walter, surprised by the sudden command, slowly turned around, careful not to drop his groceries. The plastic bags crinkled softly in his weathered hands. "Good evening, officer," Walter replied calmly, his voice carrying the gentle tone that had earned him respect from generations of students. "Is there something wrong?" Officer Matthews approached him with quick, forceful steps, his face twisted in an expression of unwarranted suspicion. "What's that in your hand?" he demanded, pointing at Walter's cane. "This is my walking cane, officer," Walter explained patiently, holding it up slightly. "I need it for my arthritis. I've had it for about 5 years now." But Officer Matthews wasn't interested in explanations. His eyes narrowed as he circled around Walter like a predator sizing up its prey. Several passers-by slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Among them was Mrs. Martinez, who owned the local bakery and had known Walter for decades. "Put down the bags and the weapon," Matthews ordered, his hand now gripping his service weapon. The evening air grew thick with tension as Walter carefully placed his grocery bags on the ground, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "Officer, I assure you this is just a medical aid," Walter tried to explain again, his heart beginning to race despite his outward calm. "If you'd like, I have a prescription from Dr. Thompson in my wallet." "I said put it down," Matthews shouted, taking an aggressive step forward. His face had grown red with anger, and his body language suggested he was looking for confrontation rather than understanding. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Several people had their phones out, recording the increasingly tense situation. Mrs. Martinez had stepped closer, her face etched with worry as she witnessed the unreasonable treatment of her old friend. "Please, officer," Walter spoke softly, still maintaining his dignity despite the humiliating situation. "I'm just heading home from buying groceries. I've lived in this community for over 40 years. The sun had almost completely set now, and the streetlights were flickering to life one by one. The golden glow illuminated the scene like a spotlight on a stage, highlighting the stark contrast between Walter's composed demeanor and Officer Matthews' escalating aggression. Little did anyone know that these moments would soon spark a chain of events that would shake their peaceful town to its core. As more phones recorded and more witnesses gathered, the tension continued to build. Walter Richardson stood there, a respected elder of his community, facing unwarranted hostility simply for walking home with his cane. The autumn wind picked up, scattering leaves across the sidewalk as the situation teetered on the edge of a precipice. In the distance, a car horn honked, and somewhere a dog barked, but on this stretch of Cedar Street, time seemed to stand still as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The tension in the air reached a breaking point as Officer Matthews moved closer to Walter Richardson. The evening had grown darker, and the harsh glow of streetlights cast strange shadows across the scene. More neighbors had gathered, their faces filled with concern and disbelief at what they were witnessing. "I'm going to say this one last time," Matthews growled, his hand still gripping his weapon. "Drop that stick now." His voice echoed off the brick buildings lining Cedar Street, making several onlookers flinch. Walter's arthritis was acting up from standing so long, and his knee began to tremble slightly. He leaned more heavily on his cane, which only seemed to anger Officer Matthews further. "Officer, please," Walter said, his voice remaining steady despite his growing fear. "I can show you my medical ID card." Before Walter could finish his sentence, Matthews lunged forward. With a violent swipe, he knocked the cane from Walter's hand, sending it clattering across the sidewalk. Without his support, Walter stumbled, his weakened knees buckling beneath him. "Get on the ground," Matthews shouted, even though Walter was already falling. Mrs. Martinez screamed from the sidelines, and several people rushed forward to help, but Matthews drew his weapon, making them freeze in their tracks. Walter hit the concrete hard, his palms scraping against the rough surface as he tried to break his fall. His groceries spilled across the sidewalk, oranges rolling into the street while his carefully selected sweet potatoes scattered across the pavement. The pie he had planned to make for his granddaughter would never be baked. "Stay back," Matthews warned the crowd, his eyes wild with an inexplicable rage. He pressed his knee into Walter's back, ignoring the elderly man's gasps of pain. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Walter managed to say, his face pressed against the cold concrete. His glasses had been knocked askew, and he could feel a sharp pain in his hip where he had landed. By now, at least a dozen people were recording the incident on their phones. Among them was Jason Chen, a local journalism student who was live-streaming everything to social media. The number of viewers grew by the hundreds with each passing minute. Mrs. Martinez had finally gathered her courage and stepped forward. "Officer, please stop. This is Walter Richardson. He taught my children mathematics. He's lived here longer than you've been alive." But Matthews wasn't listening. He roughly grabbed Walter's arms, twisting them behind his back as he reached for his handcuffs. The metal clinked loudly in the evening air as he tightened them far more than necessary around Walter's thin wrists. "Someone call 911. A voice shouted from the crowd. "Call the police on the police." Several people already had their phones to their ears, desperately trying to reach other officers or the police chief. Walter's face remained pressed against the sidewalk, his breath coming in short gasps as Matthews continued to pin him down. "I can't breathe properly," Walter said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The pain in his hip was getting worse, and his chest felt tight from the pressure of Matthews' knee. The crowd had grown larger, their angry voices rising into the night air. Cars were stopping in the street, their headlights illuminating the scene like spotlights. Someone had run to get Walter's wife, Mary, who lived just 2 blocks away. Through it all, Walter Richardson maintained his dignity. Even as he lay handcuffed on the cold concrete, he didn't curse or shout. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Matthews' continuing aggression. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Multiple police cars were responding to the numerous 911 calls, their blue and red lights painting the street in alternating colors. The video of the incident had already been shared thousands of times online, and news vans were on their way. The peaceful evening in Millbrook had transformed into a scene of injustice that would soon capture national attention. As Walter lay there, he thought of all his former students who had trusted him, looked up to him, and learned from him over the years. Now they would learn a different kind of lesson, one about standing up against injustice and fighting for change. The autumn night had grown cold, but the heat of anger and outrage continued to build in the growing crowd. Change was coming to Millbrook, sparked by one officer's actions against a respected elder of the community. The next few hours would set in motion events that would reshape not just their town, but communities across the nation. By midnight, the video of Walter Richardson's arrest had spread like wildfire across social media. Jason Chen's live stream had been viewed over 1 million times, and major news networks were already picking up the story. The peaceful town of Millbrook had suddenly become the center of national attention. At Millbrook General Hospital, Mary Richardson sat beside her husband's bed, holding his hand as doctors examined his injuries. Walter had suffered a dislocated hip, multiple bruises, and cuts on his palms from the fall. His wedding ring had cut into his finger when Matthews had roughly handcuffed him, leaving a painful mark that would take weeks to heal. Outside the hospital, hundreds of community members had gathered for a candlelight vigil. They held signs reading "Justice for Walter" and "Teachers deserve respect." Among them were generations of Walter's former students, many of whom had driven hours after seeing the video online. Sarah Martinez, Mrs. Martinez's daughter, and now a civil rights attorney in Chicago, had already boarded a red-eye flight to Millbrook. She had watched her former math teacher being brutalized on social media and immediately knew she had to help. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from other lawyers offering their support. At the police station, Chief Thompson was facing a crisis. The department's phones were ringing nonstop, and their social media pages were flooded with demands for Officer Matthews' immediate termination. Local news vans had set up camp outside, the bright lights illuminating the building through the night. "This isn't just going away," Deputy Chief Rogers told Thompson as they reviewed the body camera footage for the third time. The video clearly showed Matthews' aggressive behavior from the start, with no justification for his actions. "We need to take decisive action." Meanwhile, Walter's granddaughter Emily, who had been expecting to enjoy her grandfather's sweet potato pie that weekend, was instead organizing a social media campaign. As a popular influencer with a large following, she knew how to keep the story in the public eye. Her post about her grandfather, including photos of him teaching and helping students over the years, had touched hearts across the country. At the local community center, Reverend James Brown called an emergency meeting. The large hall was packed with concerned citizens, community leaders, and civil rights activists. The atmosphere was charged with emotion as people shared their own experiences with discrimination and discussed ways to prevent such incidents in the future. "Mr. Richardson didn't just teach us mathematics," spoke Michael Chen, Jason's father and a successful businessman. "He taught us dignity, respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Now it's our turn to stand up for him." The meeting resulted in a list of demands for the police department: immediate termination of Officer Matthews, a complete review of police training procedures, establishment of a civilian oversight board, and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. Local business owners along Cedar Street, where the incident had occurred, began putting up signs supporting Walter in their windows. Johnson's grocery store, where Walter had bought his groceries, announced they would donate a portion of their weekly profits to cover his medical expenses. Social media continued to explode with support. #JusticeForWalter and #MillbrookStrong were trending nationally. Videos of Walter's former students sharing stories about his impact on their lives went viral, painting a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to uplifting others. In her hospital room, Mary Richardson's phone kept buzzing with messages of support. The nurses had brought in extra chairs to accommodate the steady stream of visitors, from former students to community leaders. Each person who entered the room shared a story about how Walter had touched their lives. Walter, despite his pain, maintained his characteristic dignity. When a reporter managed to slip into his room and ask how he felt about Officer Matthews, he simply said, "I hope this becomes a teaching moment for our community." Sometimes the most important lessons are the hardest to learn. As dawn approached, the town of Millbrook had transformed. What had started as a horrific incident of police brutality had awakened a spirit of unity and determination in the community. Signs of support appeared on lawns across town, and plans for a peaceful march were already underway. The story had struck a chord nationwide because Walter Richardson represented something universal: the dignified elder, the dedicated teacher, the peaceful citizen wronged by those sworn to protect him. His graceful response to injustice would soon inspire changes that would reach far beyond the borders of their small town. The morning after the incident, Police Chief Thompson sat in his office, staring at the stack of files on his desk. Officer James Matthews' personnel folder lay open, revealing a troubling pattern that should have raised red flags months ago. 3 complaints of excessive force in his short 8-month career with the department, all involving minority citizens. Each complaint had been dismissed with minimal investigation. "Chief, the FBI is here," his secretary announced through the intercom. The involvement of federal authorities showed just how serious the situation had become. Within hours of the incident, the Department of Justice had launched a civil rights investigation. Special Agent Karen Williams walked into the office, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Chief Thompson," she said, her voice professional but stern, "we need to talk about Officer Matthews' history and why these previous complaints weren't properly investigated." Meanwhile, in another part of the police station, internal affairs investigators were reviewing the body camera footage for the 5th time. The video was damning. It showed Matthews approaching Walter without cause, ignoring his reasonable explanations, and escalating the situation unnecessarily. The sound of Walter's cane clattering on the concrete and his quiet gasps of pain were clear in the recording. "Look at this," Detective Rodriguez pointed to the screen. Matthews had his hand on his weapon before he even got out of the car. He was looking for trouble from the start. The team had been working through the night, interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. At the district attorney's office, Sarah Martinez, now acting as the Richardson family's attorney, met with District Attorney James Wilson. She spread out the evidence on his desk. Medical reports showing Walter's injuries, photographs of the scene, witness statements, and screenshots of Matthews' controversial social media posts that have been uncovered. "This isn't just about one incident," Sarah explained, her voice firm. "Officer Matthews has a history of racial bias. Look at these Facebook posts from 6 months ago. The posts revealed a pattern of discriminatory attitudes that should have been caught during the hiring process." Back at the police station, Deputy Chief Rogers was interviewing Officer Matthews' former training supervisor from the police academy. "He was always aggressive during simulations," the supervisor admitted. "We noted concerns about his temperament, but he knew the rules and procedures well enough to pass." The investigation expanded beyond Matthews himself. Internal Affairs began examining the department's hiring practices, training procedures, and complaint investigation protocols. They discovered that the system for handling civilian complaints was deeply flawed, with many cases being dismissed without proper review. Local journalist Lisa Thompson, who had been covering the police department for 20 years, received an anonymous tip from within the department. Documents showed that Matthews had been rejected by 3 other police departments before Millbrook hired him. This information had been available but ignored during his hiring process. In the police department's break room, officers discussed the case in hushed tones. Many were angry at Matthews for tarnishing their reputation, while others worried about the increased scrutiny they would all face. Veteran officers shared stories of times they had encountered Walter Richardson over the years, always finding him to be a respectful and valued member of the community. Chief Thompson's phone rang again. It was the mayor, demanding updates on the investigation. The story had reached national news networks, and the pressure for swift action was mounting. Protests continued outside the police station, growing larger each day. The investigation revealed more troubling details. Matthews' body cam had captured him making racist remarks during other stops, but these incidents had never been flagged during routine reviews. The department's body cam review protocol, which only examined footage when a complaint was filed, was clearly inadequate. Sarah Martinez worked late into the night, preparing documentation for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. The evidence was overwhelming. Excessive force, civil rights violations, and a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. By the end of the week, Internal Affairs had compiled a comprehensive report. The findings were clear. Matthews had violated multiple department policies and federal laws. But the investigation had uncovered something bigger: systemic failures in training, oversight, and accountability that had allowed someone like Matthews to wear a badge. The report would lead to changes that would reshape the department from the ground up. The incident with Walter Richardson had exposed deep-rooted issues that could no longer be ignored. As Chief Thompson prepared to face the press, he knew that the hardest part of his job was just beginning: rebuilding trust with a community that had been betrayed by one of their own officers. The Millbrook County Courthouse was packed on the morning of the first hearing. Every wooden bench was filled with community members, reporters, and civil rights activists. Walter Richardson sat in the front row, his cane now replaced with a newer, sturdier model donated by a medical supply company. His wife Mary held his hand tightly as Officer James Matthews was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. District Attorney James Wilson had decided to pursue serious charges: assault, battery, civil rights violations, and official misconduct. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew high-profile police cases were never simple. Still, as he stood before Judge Helena Rodriguez, his voice was confident and clear. "Your Honor," Wilson began, "the people will prove that Officer Matthews not only violated Mr. Richardson's civil rights but also betrayed the trust of the entire community he swore to protect." The courtroom remained silent as he detailed the charges, the only sound being the scratch of reporters' pens on paper. Sarah Martinez, now leading a team of civil rights attorneys in a parallel civil suit, sat behind the prosecution. They had filed a $10 million lawsuit against both Matthews and the police department. The lawsuit detailed not just the physical injuries Walter had suffered, but the emotional trauma and the department's failure to properly screen and train their officers. Matthews' defense attorney, John Parker, seemed uncomfortable as he presented his client's case. "My client was responding to what he perceived as a potential threat," he argued weakly. The words rang hollow as the prosecution played the body camera footage on the courtroom's large screen. Several jurors visibly winced when they heard the sound of Walter's cane being knocked away. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs and chanted for justice. Local businesses had closed for the day, allowing their employees to attend the hearing. Students from Millbrook High School, where Walter had taught for so many years, organized a peaceful demonstration on the courthouse steps. During a break in proceedings, Emily, Walter's granddaughter, updated her social media followers. Her posts about the trial had garnered national attention, with civil rights leaders and celebrities sharing her updates. The hashtag Justice for Walter had evolved into a movement bigger than just one case. The prosecution's case was strong. They called witness after witness. Mrs. Martinez, who had filmed part of the incident, Jason Chen, whose live stream had gone viral, and several of Walter's former students who had witnessed the attack. Each testimony painted a picture of a respected community elder being brutalized without cause. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. Thompson, Walter's physician of 20 years. He explained how the attack had worsened Walter's arthritis and caused new health issues. "Mr. Richardson now struggles with anxiety when he sees police cars," the doctor testified. "A man who spent his life serving his community now feels afraid in it." Matthews himself took the stand, but his testimony only hurt his case further. Under cross-examination, his previous racist social media posts were revealed, and his attempts to justify his actions fell apart. The jury's expressions showed they weren't buying his explanations. In the civil case proceedings, Sarah Martinez presented evidence of systemic problems within the police department. She had uncovered internal memos warning about Matthews' behavior that had been ignored, training deficiencies that had never been addressed, and a pattern of similar incidents that had been swept under the rug. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the jury needed only 4 hours to reach their verdict. As Judge Rodriguez called the court to order, Walter sat straight in his chair, the dignity that had marked his entire teaching career still evident in his bearing. In the matter of the state versus James Matthews, on the count of aggravated assault, the judge's voice rang through the silent courtroom. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Matthews would face significant prison time, and his career in law enforcement was permanently over. The civil case was settled shortly after the criminal verdict. The police department agreed to pay $5 million in damages and implement comprehensive reforms. The settlement included mandatory de-escalation training, improved screening of officer candidates, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. As Walter left the courthouse that day, supported by his family and surrounded by well-wishers, he stopped to address the crowd. "This case was never about revenge," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle strength that had guided countless students. "It was about making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else in our community." The autumn sun was setting behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps where Walter had taught his students about mathematics and where justice had finally been served. The legal proceedings had ended, but their impact on Millbrook and communities across the nation was just beginning. Departmental Reform, Part 6. 6 months after the verdict, the Millbrook Police Department looked very different. The old brass sign on the building had been joined by a new one reading "Community First, Protect and Serve with Dignity." Inside, Chief Thompson stood before a room full of officers, both veteran and newly recruited, as they prepared for their first day of enhanced training. "What happened to Walter Richardson changed everything," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-learned lessons. "Today, we start becoming the department our community deserves." The room was filled with both familiar faces and new recruits, all selected through a rigorous screening process that emphasized emotional intelligence and community connection. Dr. Marcus Chen, a respected expert in racial bias and police reform, had been hired to oversee the department's transformation. He moved around the training room, watching as officers participated in new simulation exercises that focused on de-escalation and communication skills. The scenarios were based on real situations, including the incident with Walter. "Remember," Dr. Chen explained to a group of officers practicing with an elderly actor using a mobility aid, "your first response should always be to communicate and understand. Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." The officers nodded, taking notes and asking questions about proper approaches. In another room, Sarah Martinez, who had helped win the civil case, was now conducting workshops on civil rights and community relations. She had been appointed to lead the newly established Civilian Oversight Board, which included community leaders, civil rights advocates, and former law enforcement professionals. The changes weren't just in training. The department had implemented a new system for handling civilian complaints. Every complaint was now thoroughly investigated by an independent panel, and body camera footage was reviewed daily, not just when incidents were reported. Officers who showed exceptional community service were publicly recognized and rewarded. Walter Richardson himself had become a regular visitor to the department, though not in the way anyone had expected. At Chief Thompson's request, he had agreed to share his story with new recruits, helping them understand the impact of their actions on community members. His presence served as a powerful reminder of why these reforms were necessary. "When I was teaching mathematics," Walter told a group of cadets, his new cane resting beside him, "I always said that every mistake is an opportunity to learn. What happened to me was more than a mistake, but we can still learn from it and create positive change." The department had also launched a community outreach program. Officers were required to spend time each week in local schools, community centers, and neighborhood events. They weren't just there to maintain order. They were there to build relationships, understand concerns, and become part of the community they served. Mrs. Martinez's bakery had become an unofficial meeting spot for these community police dialogues. Over coffee and pastries, officers and residents discussed local issues, shared concerns, and worked together to find solutions. The sight of police officers and community members sharing tables and conversation became a symbol of the changing times. Technology played a crucial role in the reforms. The department had invested in advanced body cameras with improved audio and video quality. A new software system flagged concerning patterns in officer behavior before they escalated into serious incidents. Every police vehicle was equipped with cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with the public. The Civilian Oversight Board met monthly in the community center, their meetings open to the public and streamed online for transparency. They reviewed police policies, investigated complaints, and made recommendations for further improvements. The first major initiative was a scholarship program for minority students interested in law enforcement careers. These changes hadn't come easily. Some veteran officers had resisted the new requirements, and a few had chosen to retire or transfer. But those who remained found that the reforms made their jobs easier and more rewarding. Crime rates had started to drop as community trust increased, and tips from citizens helped solve cases more quickly. 1 year after the incident, the Millbrook Police Department had become a model for other cities looking to implement similar reforms. Law enforcement officials from across the country visited to study their programs and procedures. The department that had once made headlines for brutality was now being recognized for innovation and community engagement. As Walter watched these changes unfold, he felt a familiar sense of satisfaction, the same feeling he used to get when his students finally understood a difficult concept. His suffering had led to transformation, and his community was becoming stronger and safer because of it. The lessons learned in Millbrook were spreading, creating ripples of change that would touch countless other lives. On a crisp morning 18 months after the incident, Walter Richardson stood at the podium in the Millbrook Community Center. The room was filled with cameras, reporters, and community members. Behind him sat his wife, Mary, their children and grandchildren. In the front row, Mrs. Martinez wiped tears from her eyes as Walter prepared to announce the launch of the Richardson Foundation for Justice and Community Healing. "From pain, we can create purpose," Walter began, his voice steady and strong. "Today, we're not just launching a foundation, we're creating a pathway to prevent what happened to me from happening to others." He held up a check for $2.5 million, half of his settlement money, which would fund the foundation's initial programs. In the state penitentiary 50 miles away, former officer James Matthews sat in his cell, watching the announcement on the small TV in the common area. He had been sentenced to 8 years, and the time behind bars had changed him. Through a prison rehabilitation program, he had begun to understand the depth of his actions and their impact on the community. The Richardson Foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement or civil rights law. Emily, Walter's granddaughter, had quit her job as a social media influencer to become the foundation's communications director. Her first-hand experience with viral activism had taught her the power of digital storytelling for social change. Our first class of scholars includes 20 students from across the state, Emily announced proudly. Each one is committed to returning to their community after graduation to make a difference. The scholars stood and were recognized, their young faces full of determination and hope. Sarah Martinez, still serving on the Civilian Oversight Board, had helped design the Foundation's police training program. "We're not just teaching officers about what not to do," she explained to reporters. "We're helping them understand how to be true guardians of their communities." The program would eventually be adopted by police academies across the country. Dr. Thompson, Walter's longtime physician, had also joined the Foundation's board. He helped create a support network for victims of police brutality, ensuring they receive both medical care and mental health services. The program paid special attention to elderly victims who often faced unique challenges in recovery. The healing wasn't just institutional, it was personal too. Walter had started a support group that met weekly in the community center. People shared their stories, their fears, and their hopes for the future. The group included both victims of police misconduct and officers committed to change, creating dialogue that bridged long-standing divides. Mary Richardson, who had stayed strong through her husband's recovery, now led workshops for families affected by police violence. "Healing doesn't happen in isolation," she would say. "It happens in community, with understanding and support from others who have walked similar paths." The Foundation's work caught the attention of national civil rights organizations. Walter was invited to speak at conferences and police academies across the country. His gentle wisdom and focus on transformation rather than punishment resonated with audiences everywhere. He never sought revenge, only change. 1 year into its operation, the Foundation received an unexpected letter. It was from James Matthews, writing from prison. He asked for forgiveness and requested permission to share his story as part of the Foundation's training programs after his release. Walter's response was characteristic of his grace. "Your story is as important as mine in preventing future tragedy." The Foundation's impact spread beyond Millbrook. Other communities facing similar challenges reached out for guidance in implementing reforms. Walter and his team traveled across the country, helping establish civilian oversight boards and training programs. The ripple effects of one violent incident were transforming into waves of positive change. Local schools incorporated the Foundation's curriculum on civil rights and community relations. Children learned about what had happened to their beloved former teacher, but more importantly, they learned about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of turning pain into purpose. On the anniversary of the incident, instead of protests, Millbrook held a community celebration of progress. The street where Walter had been assaulted was renamed Unity Way, and a small plaza was dedicated to commemorating the changes that had grown from that dark moment. Walter stood in the plaza, surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors. His new cane, inscribed with messages of hope from his former students, rested firmly on the ground. The foundation he had built was stronger than the force that had once knocked him down, and its impact would continue long after the physical scars had faded. Sometimes, he told the gathered crowd, the best teaching moments come from the hardest experiences. What matters is not what happens to us, but what we choose to do with it. His words echoed through the plaza, a testament to the power of healing, justice. 2 years had passed since the incident that changed Millbrook forever. On a warm spring morning, Walter Richardson stood before a crowd of hundreds gathered at the National Conference on Police Reform in Washington, D.C. His story, which had started with a violent encounter on a small-town sidewalk, had become a catalyst for nationwide change. Change, Walter told the audience, is like teaching a difficult math problem. It takes patience, understanding, and most importantly, the willingness to try new approaches when old ones fail. The conference hall was filled with police chiefs, civil rights leaders, and community activists from across the country, all taking notes as he spoke. The Richardson Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a local initiative had expanded into a national organization with offices in 12 cities. Emily, Walter's granddaughter, now managed a team of social media experts who shared success stories and educational content with millions of followers. James Matthews, recently released from prison after serving his sentence, had surprised everyone by becoming one of the Foundation's most effective speakers. He traveled to police academies across the country, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked bias and aggressive policing. His transformation from aggressor to advocate had become a powerful symbol of change. "I carry the shame of what I did," Matthews told a group of cadets at a police academy in Chicago, "but I also carry the responsibility to prevent others from making the same mistakes." Walter sat in the back of the room during these presentations, his presence a reminder of both the injury and the healing that were possible. The Millbrook model of police reform had been adopted by departments in over 50 cities. Crime rates in these communities had dropped significantly as trust between police and residents grew stronger. The civilian oversight board structure, first tested in Millbrook, had become a standard recommendation for departments across the nation. Mrs. Martinez's bakery had evolved into a chain of community cafes called Common Ground, where police officers and residents could meet for coffee and conversation. These spaces, now present in 20 cities, served as informal meeting places where barriers between law enforcement and communities could be broken down one cup of coffee at a time. Sarah Martinez had been appointed to a federal task force on police reform, bringing the lessons learned from Millbrook to the national level. The training programs she had helped develop were now mandatory in police academies across several states. "What happened to Walter showed us what needed to change," she often said. "His response showed us how to make that change happen." The Richardson Foundation's scholarship program had graduated its first class of law enforcement officers and civil rights attorneys. These young professionals, trained in community-oriented policing and civil rights law, were already making their mark in departments and law firms across the country. They called themselves Richardson's Rangers, committed to protecting both civil rights and public safety. Walter's original sweet potato pie recipe, which he never got to make that fateful day, had become a symbol of community healing. Mrs. Martinez's bakeries now sold Mr. Richardson's peace pies, with a portion of the proceeds going to the foundation. The recipe card included the story of transformation that had begun on that autumn evening. Technology developed for the Millbrook Police Department had evolved into a comprehensive software platform used by departments nationwide. The system, which monitored officer behavior patterns and promoted community engagement, was named WALTIR: Watch, Assess, Learn, Train, Engage, Reform. Mary Richardson had published a book titled Standing Strong, A Story of Love, Justice, and Community Healing. It became a bestseller and was now required reading in many criminal justice programs. She toured the country, speaking about the importance of family support in the face of injustice and the power of transforming pain into purpose. The small plaza on Unity Way had become a national landmark, visited by people from around the world who wanted to learn about community transformation. Walter's old cane, the one Matthews had knocked away, was displayed in a civil rights museum alongside other artifacts of incidents that had sparked positive change. On the second anniversary of the Foundation's launch, Walter received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to civil rights and community policing. As he stood in the White House, supported by his new cane and surrounded by family, he remembered the words he had often told his math students: "Every problem has a solution if you're willing to work for it." The impact of that autumn evening continued to ripple outward. What had started as a moment of injustice had transformed into a movement of hope. Walter Richardson's legacy wasn't just in the programs he had created or the changes he had inspired. It was in the countless lives touched by the simple message that justice and healing could go hand in hand. The greatest lesson, Walter told a reporter on his way out of the White House, is that change is always possible, no matter how dark the moment might seem. His words, like his actions, continued to light the way forward for communities across the nation.